With Backrooms and Obsession sweeping at the box office, and The Mandalorian and Grogu absolutely flopping by comparison, the internet has been awash with headlines and Instagram posts and articles about YouTubers saving Hollywood, or being kind of like the new voice of Hollywood that we've been waiting for. You know, this is also off the back of the success of things like Bring Her Back, Talk to Me, to a lesser extent Shelby Oaks and that Iron Lung film. But you've obviously clicked on this video for a Backrooms review, but before really getting into the meat of that, it's tricky to know which avenue we should go down, because on one hand, we've got a really competent, interesting, if not a little bit flawed, which we'll get into, film made by someone really young off the back of some internet folklore, let's say. And on the other hand, we've also got this kind of watershed moment that's happening in cinema and Hollywood that feels like a moment that's kind of happened spontaneously, that can't be ignored or disregarded, but it's really difficult viewing this film in a vacuum without considering like what we've got here. Hi, I'm Chris. I like talking about films and books and games, and I like making videos about them, and maybe you do too, and that's exactly why you're here. So welcome to this low-key Backrooms take. You know, there might be some spoilers, so if you haven't seen it already, maybe click away, and if we see a drop in retention, then that'll be why, but thanks for being here, basically. You know, I once did a bit of a cynical review of the F1 film last summer, where I unpacked what it meant for mainstream blockbusters and how these things feel like big corporate cosigns, or, you know, it just feels like one big advert, let's say. And it was a bit of like a, is this what blockbusters need to be to get made now? Kind of discussion. It was my personal take of the film, and it got met with a lot of pushback in the comments that I didn't understand the film, or I misunderstood the point of the film, you know, which is fair. But I don't know, with something like Backrooms in particular, it does feel like a bit of a watershed moment of like, is this what Hollywood blockbusters are going to be from now on? And is this how we're going to talk about them? And is this who's going to be making them? So I feel like we just have to establish up front before reviewing the film, Hollywood and its output is not spontaneous. These are not watershed moments, and they're not happy coincidences. A film like Backrooms and this kind of trend of YouTuber filmmakers, these things have been years and years in the making and of planning. There's stakeholders, there's production companies, there are gatekeepers, and there's a lot of money involved as well. And for Backrooms in particular, we're talking about a project that started in a bedroom 4 years ago in lockdown, and since then different producers and production companies have come and gone trying to get this film made. Meanwhile, in that time, you know, A24 is becoming one of the biggest independent production companies we've got at the moment. They now do co-productions with things like Amazon and MGM Studios. We've had things like the explosion of Zach Cregger, Osgood Perkins, Ari Aster and Robert Eggers, if we're going to go way back to A24's beginnings. And A24 are literally producing the Elden Ring adaptation, which is reportedly costing like $200 million. So as independent and as low budget as this film feels being made by A24, we have to admit now that A24 are a big production company. I think we just have to recognize that what we're seeing on screen with Backrooms is the culmination of years of pre-production, Zoom calls, boardroom meetings, and fronting of a lot of money, which I think lends itself to the product that we've got in the end. So, and sometimes I just can't help but view a movie through that lens. It's really hard to separate or look at the movie in a vacuum without thinking about the kind of the economic context of the film in which it was made. So, without further ado, here's what I thought of Backrooms, the movie. For those who don't know, the vaguest plot synopsis of Backrooms is a strange doorway appears in the basement of a furniture showroom. Chiwetel Ejiofor stars as a down-on-his-luck alcoholic furniture salesman, and Renate Rensive co-stars as his therapist who is haunted by her troubled upbringing. Now, the things that I liked about Backrooms. I think a lot of this good stuff will probably echo of a lot of sentiment that you've heard online. So about boiling the ocean, as one of my friends likes to say, I think the overall premise is really curious. It's foreboding and inexplicable, and I think it's executed extremely well. The set design, lighting, and cinematography is exquisite, despite how kind of ugly looking it is. It's very beautiful and soft and just strange and particular, which I think is really nice to see in a sort of big modern film. The performances do exactly what they need for the film that they're in. I think they both do a great job. I'm a huge Renate Rensive fan. I'm a huge fan of her. I love her in The Worst Person in the World, and I think she was really good in Sentimental Value as well. She was in something else recently, wasn't she? She was in like another Hollywood film. A Different Man. I really liked her in A Different Man as well. And Presumed Innocent. Anyway, I digress. The found footage sequences are also extremely effective. I'm quite a scaredy cat when it comes to horror movies, especially horror movies in the cinema, and I did find myself looking at the floor and maybe closing my eyes a couple of times, just because the tension and the atmosphere was built so effectively that, you know, it made me uncomfortable. It's a very kind of uncomfortable film to watch. And this is the thing. A lot of what makes the film good is what makes the short films that Kane Parson made on YouTube good as well. It's the visuals, it's the set pieces of discovering a crack in the wall that leads to another dimension. It's the anticipation of turning a corner and not knowing what's lurking in the distance or not knowing what's lurking in the shadows. It's the sort of sound design of the found footage element of it too that is so good, and what I love about the short films too. Every breath, every footstep, every rattle in the background play a huge part in building the overall texture of the film. You know, during the found footage sequences, every movement is hugely exaggerated with muffles and peaking audio to the point where you can hear the rustling of everyone's jackets and trousers and hazmat suits. You can hear the thump of every footstep and you can actually feel it quite viscerally. All this works spectacularly. I was well and truly locked in from the minute they were in the Backrooms. And on that note, like what the Backrooms itself represents, at least from the perspective of Kane Parsons when he's talked about it online, is really interesting to me too. Like, here's a guy in his early 20s, he's lived through a pandemic, the destabilization of modern society through technology and social media, and just about every other existential threat you can imagine has happened in his lifetime, and he can see it all the minute he opens his phone and looks on the internet. And I think all of these kind of things, this is all taking place when Backrooms as a film is at its most abstract. You know, it's the sections where there's very little dialogue. It's the sections where there's very little explanation as to what's happening. It's the sections where we're kind of discovering the Backrooms with another character without any spoken word. And it's the sections where there's kind of actually no end in sight as well. I think, you know, narratively and structurally speaking, when Clark first enters the Backrooms, you kind of actually don't really know how long this sequence is going to go on for, because he turns one corner, then he turns another corner. Then there's something in the distance and we turn another corner. Then we're in another room. Then we're going through a crawl space. Then we're in another room and we're going up a tiny claustrophobic crawl space. Then we're in another room. And you kind of do think, I could just watch an entire film of this. This kind of feels like when you're kind of cave exploring in Minecraft, where you just keep going. You just keep wanting to turn the corner. You keep wanting to see what the other room is going to show, because it just feels randomly generated every time. And I think that is when the film really cooks, when there's kind of this sort of abstract vibe going on that's really hard to define and really hard to put into words. You know, if we take a step back, a lot of that sounds quite familiar with things when we talk about like David Lynch's work and when we call things Lynchian, art house, or even something independent or European, or when we think about Japanese horror. I know things like Kurosawa's Cure and Pulse has kind of been thrown around when we're talking about things like Obsession and Backrooms in particular. But I think what makes those things shine is how it's comfortable in the inexplicable, and it's almost confident with its lack of answers and with its lack of explanation. You know, when we think about things like Blue Velvet or Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive, a lot of that is very inexplicable. When we think about that interview with David Lynch and Mark Kermode, David Lynch will just refuse to tell you what the film is about or what he thinks the film is about. And I think that this is where Backrooms kind of falls short for me, because there's this clear fork in the road the writers and producers choose to take with this film. Do you stay in this liminal space and have audiences leaving not knowing what it was about? Or do you hook this idea onto two relatable characters, with big inverted commas, experiencing mental health traumas, who project what they think the Backrooms represents in the film and have them say it out loud? Or, you know, do you lean into this fresh aesthetic of the Backrooms, or do you borrow from Blair Witch Project, borrow from Stranger Things, and literally have a scene where characters explain their backstory out loud and explain what they think the Backrooms are out loud? And I think that's just where the film kind of starts to fall apart for me, because personally, I did not find these two characters and their backstories or motivations interesting enough to warrant committing to them as vehicles to discover this world in, if that makes sense. To give you an example, the first scene we get with Clark and Mary, his therapist, is them role-playing a scenario that led to Clark getting kicked out of his apartment by his partner. That's kind of like the character introduction. And regardless of what that scene is going for, it also does have payback at the end of the film. All I could hear was the hammer as it was beating me over the head with who the character was, what their hang-ups are, and what their motivation is. You know, in a film that is so committed to showing and not telling, literally every part of Clark and Mary's backstory and motivation is done with telling. You know, there are flashbacks to Mary's childhood, but even these strategically interrupt the flow of the movie almost as a box-ticking exercise to help you understand her backstory. Both their characters just feel far too functional. And I think that's the thing. It's like you've got this really interesting, abstract, inexplicable setup, but the vehicle in which we're watching this stuff unfold is with people that are very, very literal, basically. It does feel like their mental health issues are these placeholders for genuine motivation or relatability in a way, rather than being anything that's poignant or interesting to explore. We just kind of have two troubled people with troubled backgrounds, and that's it, basically. It feels like there are two films fighting against each other. You know, it's the abstract, liminal art house film that is about whatever you want it to be, and then it's the digestible, relatable, tangible character and mental health stuff that can't quite live up to what the abstraction or the concept is going for. So once all is said and done, we get to the final third act, which just results in running around being chased by a scary monster, characters going crazy and losing their minds, facial mutilation, which every modern horror film seems to be obsessed with at the moment, and nefarious, omnipresent, Stranger Things-esque science company that are maybe responsible for what's going on. The end. And that's not to say that there haven't been some really interesting takes about what this all means online. I've seen some really good perspectives that the whole facial mutilation motif is kind of to do with, like, you know, our individualism in modern society and how constantly presenting a version of ourselves online, and we're constantly trying to have some kind of autonomy in a world where we're having our autonomy stripped away from us. And so the literal facial mutilation is kind of like a horrific aggression of that. You know, I think the sort of themes about what the Backrooms represents in terms of being a copy of a copy of a copy of people's trauma is interesting. I think the discussion about it being a representation of AI is interesting as well, but I would just rather the film did not say any of that out loud, and I wish it just maybe, you know, got more comfortable with the weird and inexplicable and unspoken side of things, really. And this is kind of where the Hollywood of it all feels quite overreaching and overbearing or intrusive into what the film's about, which is a shame because for an almost 2-hour movie, it completely rips by. Like, it flew by so quickly. I was completely transfixed for the first 2 acts, but broadly, it just got me thinking about this whole YouTube turned filmmaker moment which is happening, which I think is genuinely quite exciting. You know, we say YouTuber, but broadly, I think it's actually young people and young storytellers and young filmmakers that are just coming from outside the traditional Hollywood system. You know, if we look back at, like, the 70s, you know, broadly speaking, when films were made in kind of the golden age of filmmaking of like the 30s, 40s and 50s, they were made by massive studios that owned their own cinemas and owned their own means of distribution, to the point where they could crank out, you know, big movies every year, and they could put them in their cinemas and they know that people would go and see them because that was the only thing they could see in that cinema. So you had your really big John Ford movies, and you had your really big Kubrick Spartacus movies, and you had your Lawrence of Arabia movies where a lot of money could be fronted for these huge, massive productions. And then eventually, as you kind of got into the 60s and 70s and even 80s, where people then had access to filmmaking at their fingertips, they had VHS recorders, they had Super 8 cameras, new voices then came through these big budget systems. Like, Spielberg was 25 when he made Duel in the early 70s. Scorsese was 25 when he made his first movie. Paul Thomas Anderson in the 90s was 27. Tarantino was 29. And I just wonder if we're in this kind of, you know, snake eating its own tail, you know, history repeating itself kind of moment where we're kind of done with the big Disney, Marvel, Star Wars blockbusters, done with the really big Netflix productions, and actually we just want to see new voices come through and we want to see new perspectives come through. You know, a studio like A24 can be so successful and prolific because they trust new filmmakers and new voices. If they're going to be doing a $200 million Elden Ring movie, are they just going to slowly become as big as Disney and Warner Brothers and Paramount Pictures? You know, you compare a film like Backrooms today that is making so much money at the box office with where A24 used to be back in the day with things like, we think about things like Hereditary and The Lighthouse and how small these films were, and you compare them to Civil War, Warfare, Elden Ring, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and, you know, even to an extent the drama that's got two massive Hollywood actors in it. I think there's just something interesting to be said about how, broadly speaking, we live in an extremely capitalist society, don't we, where number always has to go up. Money also always has to get bigger. Even when we're talking about cinema being dead and no one going to the theatre anymore, there are still people out there that are still able to make a lot of money. And if it's not Disney with the new Star Wars movie, then it will be A24 with the new Backrooms movie with YouTubers. And now we're just going to run away and say that YouTubers are kind of the voices of the future. And before we know it, A24 might be just as big as these massive production companies. So, and maybe that's actually what Backrooms is about. Maybe, you know, there's a sort of weird kind of irony in this. Anyway, it's sort of turning into a bit of a ramble, basically. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what your take is on this movie. I think in a vacuum, it's a really entertaining, enjoyable horror, suspense, psychological thriller movie. It does feel original in places. It's just really hard to kind of view these things in a vacuum anymore, unless it really is like an independent foreign film that's being funded by loads of charities. It's really hard to just see the sort of art at the core of something that is inherently just trying to make money. It's making me think about the Subway take I saw on Instagram the other day, that like in today's day and age, no one can just be an artist anymore. You know, if you're a singer, you have to also have a podcast. You also have to have a social media presence, and maybe even have to be a YouTuber as well. And now, to be a filmmaker, you actually have to be a YouTuber, and to have been a YouTuber, you need to have made all these short movies and sketches, and you need to have done brand deals to help sustain that, and you need to be content, basically. Like, art needs to be content to succeed. You know, as artistic as the film is, it does feel a little bit like content to me, and I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if I actually agree with that either. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you thought if you saw Backrooms. You know, it's nice to sit down and make a video about it once in a while. Click like, comment, and subscribe for more if you want to see some more, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Bye, 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 bye.